Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Twilight Show, and my name is Tony Harwood, as you can see on the screen there, and I'm delighted to be joined by my guest for this evening from Norfolk NEU, Scott Lyons. How are you doing, Scott?
Evening, Tony. Yeah, good, thank you.
Fab. So you would have seen, everyone, hopefully if you've joined, you have seen that what we're talking about is something that is impacting a lot of teachers at the moment. And we've got some statistics, some facts and figures on those that we've got from the NAS union and from their survey that they've done on 5,800 roughly teachers have responded to that survey. But it's going to be very interesting because obviously I've got Scott with me today. Myself, I'm a teacher of 24 years in secondary. I believe Scott's been in a similar time, but if you could just sort of just for people who are interested, Scott, I'm sure everyone would like to know sort of your, how your career's panned out so far.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tony. Yeah, like most people, I hadn't really considered teaching, but enjoyed school and did well at school. Hadn't really considered teaching until I was at Newcastle University, and instead of doing a dissertation, I had the opportunity to get 30 credits by doing this thing called Teachers in Schools, and I just had to go into school 6 weeks. They said you can do what you want, and I said, okay, I'll lead the sports, and that was it. I was hooked. And I just wanted to kind of teach and wanted to lead sports and teach history, and decided to go into primary school teaching. Got my first teaching job in South Leeds in a very tough inner city school, and met my wife, who's from North Norfolk, who said that, when we have children, I want to move to Norfolk. I said, oh, sounds great. And we started looking for jobs once my eldest son was born. And I always remember the head teacher from the school in Norfolk that was going, my prospective employer. He turned up at my school and he couldn't believe there was no field and all the windows had bars and all our smart boards and everything else kept getting stolen. And he said, come to Norfolk, you think it'd be a little bit different. And I came to Norfolk, working in a kind of a similar school that feeds into a council estate. And yeah, I've been a teacher across all the primary year groups, but especially upper key stage 2 for 24 years. But the last 2 years I've been a union officer, 12 years as a secretary, assistant secretary, and then secretary. And gradually I've kind of phased out my teaching days to be now 5 days union work.
Okay, fab. Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, it's interesting sort of hearing people's routes and the different routes. And obviously, I did the traditional PGCE, and I always think that was quite a nice way to come in. It felt like I was eased in, so to speak, and obviously working in some challenging schools. So I'm assuming your decision to move into the union was maybe because you kind of enjoyed working with these sorts of issues and supporting people with the sorts of issues of behaviour and so on. So what, if you don't mind me asking, what caused you to move over into the union full time?
Well, fun enough, so my background was IT. I was the head of IT at my school in South Leeds, and then when I moved to Norfolk, I did the same, and I set up websites. Funny enough, I remember my head teacher saying, "I want to set up a website in my Norfolk school," and he said, "I'll give you UPS if you do it." And I said, "Okay, I'll do that then." And I created the website, set it up, and at the same time, I'd been the rep at my previous school, and I was kind of joint rep at my school in Norfolk. Always had an interest. My background, I was a field ambulance medic in the territorial army. So my background had always been kind of physical health, and always been first aiders. So I'd always been kind of quite mindful of health and safety. So that was my kind of routine. And they asked me to run the website and set up the website for the union, and they kind of asked me if I wanted to do a bit of casework, and just like having teenagers and children, you keep saying yes to things and trying new challenges, and things just kept developing. I realised I liked doing casework, and at the same time, it was an interesting time because it was the beginning of the academisation program. So suddenly, the whole landscape kind of tore up overnight. So it was, an exciting, creative way of working with new employers, seeing new things being done. And, in Norfolk, we've been really successful that all our schools adhere to national terms and conditions. They all pay the national rates of pay. And that's partly because of our campaigning and the work we do, but also the good relationships we've got with trusts and employers.
100%. Yeah, no, that's good to know. And obviously, Norfolk is a place close to my own heart, being a Norfolk boy myself. So, but yeah, that's good to hear. I think so. We'll start to sort of delve into some of these things. Obviously, lots have changed. Something that's interesting about what you said there, and it came up on my last show, which was about challenging schools. At the time, when the academisation started, I think that had a really big impact. We can talk about it. We can be controversial about it, but let's just say there was a big shift around that time. Let's leave it. We can take it further later on. But really, what really stands out is this survey of these 5,800 teachers. Some people might look at that and say, well, the people who replied might already have some concerns about behaviour before they reply. But even so, when you look at these statistics, it's pretty damning. I'm just going to have a look at some now. So it says here, 20% of teachers surveyed out of the 5,800 have been hit or punched by pupils, and 38% had been shoved or barged, with 25% of teachers experiencing pupil violence at least once a term. And then something I think you alluded to in our little chat before the show is the difference in the sort of extreme behaviour that you get between primary and secondary, because it says on here, which sort of mirrors what you mentioned to me earlier on this evening, about more than 60% of threats of assault with a weapon came from pupils of primary school age. This is the one they all stand out. All these statistics are damning statistics, really. And, we're going to sort of start to talk about some of them in a minute. 95% of teachers experience 95% of teachers experience rudeness from pupils, with more than 25% suffering verbal abuse at least several times a week. Now, obviously, I've entitled this show "Violence Against Teachers." To me, violence can take a physical form or it can take a verbal form, and I'm sure you'd agree with me on that one. So, what sort of behaviours are you? Obviously, we can't talk about specific cases and specific individuals, schools, and so on, and trusts, but we can talk generally. What sort of issues are your members reporting, Scott, at the moment in terms of violence?
Yeah, no, Tony, it's really interesting. I was really curious about those figures when I saw those at Easter, because it kind of reflected our own survey results. So just a bit of a prologue. End of last year, we really noticed an uptick in kind of violence against staff and casework coming to us, and Unison and G&B said the exact same, especially with support staff. So in September, I sent out 10 surveys to various schools to find out what was going on, and the results were absolutely shocking. So just before Christmas, we did another survey and we got 320 replies. Over 300 were for women and females, and the results were, absolutely abhorrent. 90% of the female staff witnessing violence in schools. 1 in 3 women are considering leaving the profession due to violence. 45% had experienced weekly injuries, whether verbal or physical, and that kind of feeds into what you were saying about there's the physical violence, being punched in the face, in reception, the verbal violence, name calling, and hospital visits, but the threats and intimidation as well from those children. And then the worrying thing, and you kind of alluded to it, was what we were getting from secondary members was the kind of sexualized nature of some of that violence, threat, and harassment. And some of the stories were absolutely heartbreaking to read. And I know we're going to talk about it later, the impact, but it's not just the injury of what's happened to them, but sometimes there's the moral injury and the secondary trauma by being forced to have restorative conversations with children that have physically or sexually harmed them, and in some way they've got to reflect on what they should have done differently. And this is something I feel very strongly about, and I've supported a lot of female members through this. And I think it's something that as a union, but certainly employers, really need to look again at what restorative practice should actually be.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
All right, yeah, thank you for that. And actually, that might be a good sort of segue into that, because one of the things that we've in our previous correspondence, when you very kindly agreed to come on, Scott, you mentioned this behaviour versus therapeutic model. So you feel, and so, some of what you said kind of rings true. I think I've been quite lucky in that I've not worked at a school that's gone entirely over to the restorative justice system. It's a very controversial topic on X. Anything's controversial on X, as we know, but it's something that comes up time and time again. So so in terms of the therapeutic, what sort of issues are coming out of schools that are adopting this therapeutic or restorative practice? Would you call those the same thing? I don't know if I'm mixing up terminology.
Yeah, it's a bit of everything, and I think that's part of the problem. I think what we've got at the moment is a lot of schools that are in betwixt and between. They're seeing the behaviour model, the attainment model, but they're also getting a lot of education consultants and goodwill people saying we actually need to do some restorative practice, trauma informed care, and look at the holistic experience of the child. So some schools have kind of managed to circumnavigate both, but I think some schools are really, really struggling. And I think, unfortunately, what I predict in the future is the end of the comprehensive system in some areas, where some some schools are just going to say, okay, we're going to be a behaviour model. We're not going to have any support staff. We're going to have 40 in a class. All high achieving children that are school ready that want to be there. And then perhaps down the road or another school, they'll say, okay, well, we're going to be the hospital school, the restorative school, the therapeutic school, and we're going to do trauma-informed care, 16 in the class, loads of adults, loads of therapeutic practice and some education to treat the holistic child. And I think at the moment some schools are I know for a fact, I've spoken to quite a few employers, and they really are pondering on the next steps, whether they do kind of say, oh, look, we're going to be a behaviour model. We can't, you can send your child here and you can have as many EHCPs as you like, but we've got no teaching assistants in this school because we've got 35 school ready children in the classroom, and you'll have to consider going to one of the other schools that might be able to offer some more therapeutic intervention and education. And I think this is unfortunate, and it raises lots of other questions from ethical practice to parental choice to transporting these children. Our county going to transport a child 25 miles to a school because the parents don't want them to go to a behaviour silent corridor model school that's on their doorstep.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? It does. Obviously, schools. It feels to me like we all have a different experience, obviously, but post-pandemic and so on. But so there seems to be an epidemic at the moment. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say this. It seems like there's an epidemic in terms of poor behaviour at the moment. What do you think's causing it, Scott? Have you got any sort of theories on what sort of thing could be causing this problem?
Well, it's really interesting because obviously knowing I was coming on this, it made me really reflect on some of the conversations I've had in the last year. And it's really interesting how different people say different things. So, 2 weeks ago, I spoke to a head teacher in a very challenging school, and she says, we don't look at chronological age now with the COVID cohort coming through because they're so developmentally stunted and behind because they'd never had, they've perhaps been kind of kept away, or the parental anxiety, or not had that peer interactivity. They said they've stopped looking at chronological age for that child and thinking where they are developmentally. I spoke to some chairs of governors who said, end of the day, it's the parents' fault. We do contextual statements for PECSs, and I can tell you it's the parents' fault. And then I speak to CEOs, and the CEOs say it's the government's fault. They're not putting enough money in. If they put more money into schools, we could provide the wraparound care, the intervention, the provision, the adults into school. And then you've got teachers who are kind of caught in the middle, that they always are, Tony, aren't they? And we're kind of thinking, I'm not 100% sure who's to blame or what to do next. So it's a real cauldron of ideas and opinions on this, and yeah, it's going to be an interesting debate, in the next year or so. But I think parents are going to have some strong opinions soon on what they expect schools, what they have already, but what they're going to expect from schools in relation to behaviour. And I think some parents are not going to abide by their children being in the class being disrupted by 7 or 8 children, and their children's education being disrupted in their perception. And there's other parents that will say, I'm just not going to put up with my child doing slant and silent corridors and chanting the national anthem or the school motto. My child needs some therapeutic intervention. So I do think parental choice will drive a lot of this in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel to me that there's been, and again, it's easy to sound dramatic, but it does really feel to me that there's been a shift in needs of students. And schools are scrabbling around, aren't they, with the resources that we have, with the structure that we have, the traditional school structure of 30 students in front of one adult. And the funding, obviously, which is another, it just seems like a shift is needed, but either we don't know what that shift is, or we're not able to make it anyway. But it's hard. I mean, it's interesting you talking about that, actually, because it does make you wonder where we go from here, because there will be parents. You're absolutely right. If I speak to a parent, there'll be parents who say, what's going on? There's so much disruption in this class. Can't you just have a system whereby the students are removed if they're disrupting? And then there's the other parent who is going to think that you're getting on to their child, and that the school is too strict, and that the rules are too harsh, and that they should be able to wear whatever shoes they want. And it's just, it's really hard. And the thing that, we are in the middle, aren't we? Teachers are, and I've never really thought about it like that before. We've got all these pressures, haven't we? And yeah, but at the end of the day, we schools and teachers are going to carry the can and carry the responsibility. So it's a tricky one. Do you think parenting is an issue? Do you think parenting has changed, and do you think maybe parenting is something that we can't any longer assume that people can pick up through their families? Is there anything surrounding parenting that you think is wrong and that we could realistically change?
Yeah, I've got strong opinions on this in some ways. That I think the social contract between schools and parents has been ultimately nearly broken because of COVID. Before COVID, it was quite tacitly agreed that their parents prepared their children for school, gave them the best opportunities to come in and learn at school as much as possible. And kind of COVID kind of blurred the lines a little bit. And then some parents thought, actually, my child isn't getting the best at school for various reasons. I can educate at home, or even educate better. Or provide a different education, and schools probably overstep the line in the kind of parenting circles, providing lunches, and the government's always keen for us to do as much parenting as possible, aren't they? Look at the kind of all the kind of furore around adolescence. So I do think that perhaps nationally, which I can't imagine will happen, because parents are voters and the government don't really want to upset them, but they'll upset public servants, is that there does need to be a revisiting of the social contract. What does it mean to get your children ready for school, and what does school mean for parents? As I said I said recently on Twitter, I remember a good colleague of mine when they started reading cafes. I don't know if you know reading cafes in primary schools, where they kind of invited parents in and we'd read a book or we'd do an activity. And I always remember him about 10, 15 years ago said, Scott, this is the beginning of the end. And I was like, what? He said, if parents realise how desperate most teachers are to please their children, they'll just keep coming in with endless demands. And I was like, nah, that's not going to happen. And I'm like, I think he must have had a crystal ball, because I think they looked behind the veil. They saw how nice most school staff are, how eager we are to please the children, how eager we are for their futures. And they were like, brilliant. Someone else can work harder for my children than I'd have to.
I mean, it does. Yeah, it does sometimes feel a little bit like that, doesn't it? And it is hard to know where that line is. I've had conversations recently around exam preparation, exam stress, how to prepare students for exams, the fact that some parents may not really know or need some support with that. So it is really, hard to know how far to go as a school. We can find parents if they don't send their children to school. I'd almost dare and say it because it's going to be controversial. Can we find parents for not keeping up the contract with the school? I mean, if a parent never replies to a letter or an email, or doesn't ever attend if we need them to come in to talk about something important, but then, like I said, there's these two different directions, isn't there? That it's a therapy against sanction again, isn't it? We don't know which way to go, do we? That's the bottom line.
I do think we're in this kind of some schools are really in this halfway house, and that's why some schools, social media amplifies the extremes, and some schools are going to these extremes. We've got some well-known employers in Norfolk that are just saying, okay, we're going to be a behaviour school. Send your child here if you want high achievement, high attainment. They're school ready, clear rules, clear expectations. And it's been really popular with a lot of families, and it's had some amazing outcomes. And so and then some schools are saying actually we want to go down a therapeutic model. We want to take an ethical stance on the holistic development of that child, and we're going to invest money that way. And they've been successful too. And I think it's in the middle is what we're really talking about, where how schools try and meet the needs of parents for having both in their school. It's hard to kind of go on about your A-level results, or GCSE and A-level results, and at the same time your pastoral care and your therapeutic care for the children. And I think they're really stretched with the underfunding.
The thought just crossed my mind here. I'm not doing this in any particular logical way. Do you think the public are maybe losing trust in schools?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that I definitely think since COVID, as I said earlier, there's been a bit of a blurring of the lines, and some parents have used that to their own advantage, and some schools might have used it to their own advantage. But there's definitely been a bit of a blurring the lines, and that's why perhaps a social contract, revisiting the social contract between schools, might be a good way of kind of establishing the expectations. This is what school can provide, but this is what we expect from you as parents. And then, but the tricky bit is what's the consequence going to be? If I'm honest, when I first started union work 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of strong heads that were very robust against parents. If I'm honest, there's a lot of heads now. They cave into parents quite easily. They don't want a load of FOIs. They don't want a load of subject access requests. They don't want a Facebook campaign. And it's probably easier for some heads just to kind of collapse and give in to those parents that will kind of use threats and intimidation to kind of get their own way. And in the end, I don't think that helps anyone.
No, I mean, there's a difference between having some parental voice and some parental input, but I think you need society as a whole needs to realize that teachers are professionals and that people who run schools, we need to be able to trust them, but we don't. I mean, the things that I don't want to have a go at parents. I'm a parent. You are yourself. So first of all, we're not having a go at parents, but what we're trying to do is make people see, anyone who's watching this who's not a teacher, sort of understand kind of our position in this, because we are caught in the middle. We are here because we care about young people. And just because we're saying we want to see better behaviour in schools and we don't want to see violence in schools, that's not just protecting us, it's protecting everyone. I personally think, in my own experience, when I've been in schools where behaviour is a problem, I've experienced of schools that are in special measures. I've experienced of schools where, there was one school I worked in where there was a very nasty crime in the local community, which was then attributed to a student. So I've worked in areas where there is a lot of deprivation. And the main thing that I find that's impacting student well-being, I know we're here to talk about teachers, but they go hand in hand, is bad behaviour. So how much, we talk about trauma and trauma-informed practice, and I think it is important that we understand that, because when you know about a student's background, it's easier to understand them. But I think students are being traumatised by the behaviour in school. I mean, how could they not be? If we as adults are being traumatised and affected, then obviously the students are going to be as well. So what we're trying to do is we need some more trust back in schools. And I do agree with you. I think head teachers are saying, they are pandering a bit to parents, I think. In
a weird way, parents do trust schools, but they trust them that will never say no, will never turn their children away. They'll get turned away by their bank, their MP, they can't complain, customer services, they can't get a dentist appointment, they can't get a doctor's appointment, but they can come in and offload on us. And for some reason, certainly in the last 5 or 6 years, but certainly since COVID, schools have kind of, been complicit in that and kind of saying it's okay for you to offload on us. It's okay for your dysregulated child to offload on us, and it's okay for you to offload us in some bizarre way. And again, the trauma-informed training, which is brilliant, but a lot of that training, which has been absorbed by support staff who haven't had days and weeks of training and follow-up CPD. I think sometimes some of them have it's kind of Frankensteined in their head that it's okay for them to be emotional or physical punch bags, that it's okay for that dysregulated child because of their trauma to vent and release their trauma and pain and hurt on them. And it's a really weird thing to see and hear when members have kind of normalized it, and staff have normalized that a child has pulled their hair, or a child has put their hand up their skirt and tried to grab their privates, and they've kind of like come up with a load of reasons why it's okay for this child to do that, or he wants to connect, or he's never been able to connect with someone. And the whole point of me as a union officer is to objectively say, look, I'm going to repeat back to you what you've just said to me. And when they hear someone say, oh yeah, I've been sexually assaulted at work, or I've been violently attacked at work, and when they hear someone say it back to them, you see the penny drop to actually, yeah, this isn't acceptable. But up until then, they've kind of said, oh, this child is I know his background, I know what's happened to him, he's because he can't, he's trying to communicate through his behavior. They'll come out of all the right kind of tropes and rotes and everything else, but it's only when someone reflects back that you've been sexually assaulted, they think, wow, yeah, it's not acceptable.
No, absolutely. In your experience, Scott, do you think schools, trusts are not doing enough to protect staff from violent behaviour?
It's a bit of a weird one in schools because because of safeguarding, the proliferation of safeguarding in the last 10 years, and expectations on us. Look how big keeping children safe in education keeps getting each year. School staff are absolutely amazing at reporting, CPOMs, BROMCOMs, they're absolutely brilliant at it. But what I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years, perhaps even 10 years, is the opposite, is they forget their entitlements, rights and legal protections as an employee under the Health and Safety Acts. When I first started teaching, there used to be an accident book, there used to be an incident book, there used to be a near miss book. If you did get attacked or there was an accident or any injury, that was straight in the book. That was straight in that book. Can you tell me, or can most teachers tell me, where their health and safety reporting system is now? If there was a near miss, a child throws a chair or a pen towards you, if there was an injury, would most teachers know where to put that? And what happens if as an employer, if you kind of your health and safety committee or resource committee or people's committee each year as a trust or as a school, you get all these reports of all the violent incidents, and you look at it and you say, oh, there's been hardly any violent incidents. Yeah, we went through the health and safety book and look, there's not that much there. What you'd want to say is have a look through the CPOMs. And if the teachers actually added, but they won't do that. And so employers, I think, given them the benefit of the doubt, have got a skewed perception on what's actually gone on in the school. So one of the key message we're giving out to all our members is you've got to double report everything. If you're attacked by a child, if you're threatened by a child, you don't just put it in the CPOMs and BROMCOMs, you put it in the health and safety reporting system as well. And then when the school gets that health and safety report of all the incidents and violence in the school, they'll get an accurate picture of actually what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's the policies that maybe schools, need to try to get right. I'm just going to mention at this point that this show maybe wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for our sponsor. This show is sponsored by the John Catt Bookshop. So if you're interested in a little bit of professional development, then you can use the code that's on the screen there, JCTTR 2425, and you can get 20% off on the John Catt Bookshop. So guys, make sure that you make use of that. Some good books in there. I've had a look on there, and there's some great authors on there like Sam Strickland and people like that that I have actually tried to read myself, not something I really do enough of. But okay, back to what we were saying. So yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting to get that insight, because obviously not many of us teachers would be aware of sort of the work that you do and so on. And obviously, as we've spoken about, we can't really go into sort of a lot of detail. But what sort of, just wondering, what sort of behaviours have you or your colleagues been dealing with, and how is it actually impacting the teachers in the schools?
Yeah, I always remember one incident that kind of made me really challenge the restorative practice. For example, where I remember a young female teacher was walking down the corridor, and she was kind of grabbed from behind by a year 11 boy and told, "Miss, I'd like to F you," to put it as bluntly as that. She reported it, and the child was kind of put into internal exclusion, but per policy, she was asked to have a restorative conversation with him. And part of the restorative conversation was, the first bit was to actually ask him, did you use the restorative kind of de-escalation? So, by the senior leaders, did you use the de-escalation, the restorative kind of vocabulary and techniques? And then B, what would you have done differently? And she was encouraged to go and have this conversation with this child to kind of repair the relationship. And she was traumatized, and she got in contact with me, and she was absolutely broken. And she said, I can't be back in the room with you. I've never been treated like that, and I'm supposed to be safe in a school, and this 15-year-old boy's just done this to me. So these are the kind of incidents, and these are not uncommon. And another one that sticks into my mind, it was again a young female member, and she was doing a class, and I think the teams were put into kind of there was a quiz, and a group of boys put themselves, and they gave themselves a name called the Andrew Tates or something like that, and she kind of she said under her breath, she said, "Oh, more like to be called the misogynists," and kind of under her breath. But she ended up they reported her, and she ended up getting into trouble, and she had to kind of effectively apologise. But what happened is the rest of the boy's friends ended up ganging up on her in the school hall and wouldn't let her out of the school hall or corridor one time. And this is the danger of kind of restorative techniques and treating people equally, when actually the behaviors from those boys weren't equally, and you can't go into a restorative conversation or repair conversation when what's happened isn't equal.
No, I mean, if you're a victim of a crime in real life, outside school, I say real life, it is real life, but you know what I mean. When you left school, when you're outside, school, it's not going to work like that, is it? And it's almost like maybe the leaders in this situation are so laser focused on their particular system and what they've bought into and what they think is right in terms of trauma informed and everything else. So it's probably like they've taken their eye off the ball.
I think so. I think there's a bit of an ethical high ground from SLT. They think it's a kind of Nelson Mandela truth and reconciliation, that actually if we talk it out, nothing cannot be sorted out. But it's not kind of post-apartheid South Africa with Nelson Mandela leading this, and I think some of them think they're like that, if I'm honest, when actually they've got young vulnerable female staff not feeling safe, being intimidated by 6 foot young male men in packs and groups. And I do think some school leaders take that ethical position and they forget the actual reality on the shop floor and some of the experiences that some staff, and especially young female staff, can have.
Yeah, and you obviously you keep coming back to that. It's the female, and the female staff being the victims and the misogyny and everything else. Is that a really large part of what you're dealing with in your role at the moment? Misogyny, does it make up quite a large proportion of what you're dealing with? And why do you think that is? What do you think's driving this increase?
Yeah, it's a huge problem at the moment. I know, speaking to reps, they say the treatment of women in the workplace at the moment is the highest priority they've got. I think I've been doing some really good work with Norfolk County Council and the Police Crime Commissioner, because we really want to look at gendered pattern violence in the workplace. If employers really did look at it, and I think they're a little bit scared to look at it, a lot of the violence and aggression and intimidatory behaviour is towards female staff. But with the new new update to the Equalities Act and sexual harassment, which would mean some massive tribunal payouts, a lot of employers will kind of talk the talk about challenging violence against women and girls, but they won't do the hard work of spotting these patterns and taking some responsibility for some actions. So looking at some of the causes, I think there's definitely been a normalization. I'm always wary of trying to blame boogeymen like Andrew Tate, because I think, going back to what I said earlier, I think the real radicalization happens at home. And I think some schools have not had the guts, if I'm honest, to challenge some of the embedded and normalized misogyny that these young boys hear at home and then bring into the school place, and it's amplified and exaggerated and encouraged by others. And it's easy to blame Andrew Tate and not challenge those parents as radicalizing influences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's it's definitely something that's a big concern. And obviously it was interesting listening to all this debate over adolescence and this crazy idea, and it brings it back to this idea that our profession is so interfered with. Yeah. It's never left alone, is it? I don't know if you'd agree with me on that one.
Absolutely. I when I heard about it and read about it, my wife told me about it. She caught wind of it first. I arranged, and with her encouragement, I watched it with my teenage son, and it was really important, because I think that was the takeaway message: the disconnect, the disconnect, and the distance between children and adults today and families today. And what schools and the government should have been doing is encouraging parents to sit down with their children and watch this and have a conversation about what they see online and their attitudes online and what they hear online, what they've normalized. But what did the government do straight away? Oh, we'll get the schools to do it. And again, it's that blurring of the lines between, it goes back to what I said at the start, it's that blurring of the lines of who's the parent and who's the school, who's the educator and who's the parental familial influence in these children's lives. And if we keep blurring it all the time, no wonder parents are getting mixed messages.
I mean, that was a typical sort of knee-jerk. I don't know which member of the government or whether it was them, but it was certainly someone said maybe we should get everyone to watch this. To be honest, I've chosen not to watch it, and for me, I think it would be too, well, I wouldn't want to say close to home, but I don't think I'd want to watch it, if I'm completely honest. I mean, I suppose if you have, I mean, I've got my children are girls. They're both grown up. They're both the eldest is at university now. So obviously for me, it's a little bit of a different concern. So rather than me worrying about what I've got to do as a role model for a boy, I've got to think about, what they have to deal with, I suppose. Yeah. And it's not something, to be honest, it's probably a conversation I should have with them more often. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm the best parent out there. But like you say, these things like Andrew Tate, these influences aren't going to go anywhere, are they? So it is on the parents and and the family, the wider family as well, to make sure these young men can make the right choices and to know that what they're doing might not be the right choice. Because I think sometimes, going back to what you said, it's kind of passed off as just boys being boys, a little bit of a laugh, all the boys do that or whatever. And it is trivialized, isn't it? I think. And rather than actually addressing, the fact that it's a deep-rooted and deep-seated problem. So when just sort of thinking about your processes, so if somebody, assuming someone comes to you, Scott, and says, this is what's going on, I've had this incident, this has happened with this student, in what ways can you then, what mechanisms do you guys have to then take that forward and protect your members?
Yeah, we always try and be led by the member as much as possible. You know, we don't want to be doing things on their behalf, and they feel like that's not reflective and coherent to what they want. But most members tend to want, they're concerned about their colleagues. So if there's a violent incident, sometimes they'll say, oh, it's okay, he's like that with me. But if you kind of say, okay, what about with your TA or another colleague? Oh, I don't want him hurting her. So that's how you usually kind of get them thinking this is a collective issue. And then if we've got some massive concerns about, this is affecting other staff, we'll do a staff survey to find out and get a picture of what's going on, and we can go with that data to the employer, to the head, and say, look, something needs to be done. I usually try and go proactively with some suggestions, what's worked at other places, and we kind of have a conversation. One of our caseworkers has a conversation about, how can this go forward, and some changes. And the vast majority of the time, just highlighting it, does bring it to the head teacher's attention, because they're firefighting lots of different things, and usually we do see some improvements, but sometimes we don't, and then we have to consider, do we need to escalate? And one thing we are considering at the moment, especially in alternative provision, sadly, is using the section 44, the lack of safety, the threat of staff going into that site and being harmed. And unfortunately, again, with it is linked with funding, but it is linked with other considerations that employers aren't taking, is that staff there's no proper risk assessments, the HCPs aren't being met, the one-to-one provision and expectations aren't being done, but even the pupil handling training's not being updated, the consequences and the parental involvement is not working, and these are schools that are then harming staff. And as a union, we need to challenge that, and always go back to the health and safety laws. There's more laws protecting the staff on the site than there is the children, and I think that's what a lot of employers and certainly staff forget.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Yeah, I mean, does that... Not being obviously an expert on law and so on, does the age of the children muddy the waters? I remember seeing a comment on here on X along the lines of the age of legal responsibility or something like that. Is it sometimes difficult because we're dealing with children to actually take these cases any further? Does that tend to hit the buffers just because it's simply the rights of the child seem to trump the rights of the member of staff?
Yeah, I think there's always that consideration, and most people come into the education, the schools, and they kind of want to put children first, and they will kind of make a lot of concessions. But there are legal considerations. 10 years and above. They do can take criminal responsibility. And at our conference, we reaffirmed our commitment to behaviour, but we don't want children leaving the education sector. But we want to make sure that if they do have to leave a school, we can find the right setting for them. But that's becoming even more difficult, and the extreme behaviours are more and more challenging each year, I find. And some of the alternative provision, there's some amazing practice out there, but there's some real challenges out there as well in alternative provision schools.
Yeah, definitely. And it does feel like we are going through a period of change. And as I've said it a few times on here. I do talk about the pandemic a lot. It feels to me like a lot of people don't like it when I talk about the effect of the pandemic and how things have changed. But it does feel like there's a big change, and I'm hoping maybe we are going just through a phase where things are going to start to get better, and maybe because at the end of the day, we need to look at recruitment as an issue in our profession, don't we? We eventually it does get to the point where we do need people to want to come to work with students, which people do. But then they have the right to feel safe. And I've got to be honest, I've had experiences where I haven't felt safe. I've had times where I've taken time off with stress as a direct result of behaviour of students, and the support I either did or didn't feel that I had at that moment in time. It does feel like head teachers and school leaders are so bogged down, have so much of a workload that these things kind of fall by the wayside.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's an issue.
I think you touched on a really key point. I always remember it was fairly early on in my union work. I was contacted by a leafy South Norfolk primary school where they wanted to do a ballot to refuse to teach. So I thought, this is interesting. So I went in there, there was 4 kind of middle-aged, lovely primary school teachers in a room, and they said, "Yeah, we want a ballot to refuse to teach this child." I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, one of the colleagues over there, he threw a pen towards her. He threw a pen at her." I thought, oh, okay. And then she said, "No, he threw it towards the front of the class. It didn't hit me, but it could have done." And they were absolutely furious, and they wanted to ballot for strike action. Now, what they didn't know, the week before, I'd been in an alternative provision school where a member of ours had her hair pulled, a clump of her hair pulled out, her hair slammed into the floor, punched in the face, and threatened with rape. But because of the wraparound care, she was back in the next day, because exactly what you said, the support just molded around her, comforted her straight away. She got peer-to-peer supervision straight away. She got access to counselling. She got access to restorative conversation at her own speed. She got access to all these supports, which kind of end of the day brought her back into the school the next day. And I was it really dawned on me that, using that leafy suburb South Norfolk school near Wyndham, you can feel safe, you can feel unsafe in the safest of settings, or you can feel safe or unsafe in the safest of settings and safe in the unsafest. Because what it turned out was that after talking to those members in the leafy school, they didn't trust or feel supported by the head. The head kept undermining them. Every time they took stuff to the thing, they would say, "Well, the parents of the child have said that hasn't happened." And it was all just small things, but as you can see, it just undermined their trust and confidence and safety, even though they were in a leafy, safe school. Whilst the other school, it was a really unsafe setting, really challenging safe setting. But because of the camaraderie, the solidarity, the policies, the practices, the SLT responsibility and quick intervention, that person was back in school the next day. So it's it's a real key how you get the culture right in a school, and it's got to start from that sense of safety for the staff.
Yeah, and it's got to be a sense of safety. And again, for me, that really does go hand in hand. And you don't hear much about this. You hear a lot about people who are anti-permanent exclusion, and you can understand why people would take that point of view. But it sometimes does feel like no one is fighting for the students who are getting everything right, but are being affected by the behaviour of the minority. So it sometimes that is something that I think about, because it for me it all goes hand in hand. So I mean, how did you find when you were a teacher? I mean, I'm a secondary teacher. Did you ever come across any sort of serious misbehaviour as a primary teacher yourself?
Yeah, when I was in South Leeds, it was a real tough inner city school, and I taught year 5 and 6 there. And I'd get a lot of challenge, a lot of aggression. There was a lot of fighting. One thing, I do comment on this a lot, is that it was a big football and rugby league school, so there was an outlet for a lot of the boys' aggression, and there was also a kind of negotiation that if you don't behave, you're not going to play in the rugby team. That was did seem to calm some of them down, and there was a lot of support from the parents for the sports, but for the school as well. And if you said the child behaved like that, that was accepted. That's how the child behaved. So and the one thing I always remember, my head teacher, amazing bloke Paul, and he would kind of at the end of the day, he would say, if you want to leave at 3:45 because you feel like you've been in a scrap all day, you leave. I'll support you. Because sometimes you just need to get out the ring. And he used to say that, and he taught in inner city schools in South Leeds for a long time as well. And it's just that understanding from the head teacher makes a hell of a difference. Now, what's happened in primary schools and the same as in high schools is, when I first started teaching, there was a head teacher, deputy head, and the rest of the staff. And the deputy head kind of moved in between the two, the two worlds. Now, and I think this is part of the problem in schools, is you've got such a blurring. You've got heads of department, heads of faculty. You've got heads of department. You've got all these kind of assistant heads. They're not deputy heads and deputy heads. And you've got a head, then you've got an executive head, then you've got a trust lead, and you've got a central trust lead. And you've got all this blurring of the lines, and a lot of people that don't really know what it's like inside a classroom still, and how much it's changed. And it really has changed. And I think that is part of the problem, is a lot of people forget.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, actually. And it similar to when you get people who retire, people have gone on to then be consultants. I'm not going to have a go at consultants, obviously. I don't have a go at any groups of people on here, but it's been seismic for me, the changes that I feel I've experienced in the last sort of few years. It's really interesting how the amount of upheaval, the developmental stages of young people, as you mentioned earlier, it's schools do so much that when I think that was taken away, I think to some extent people realised a little bit about how important it was. But then you went the other way, as you've said, where some people thought, actually, well, maybe there's a better way. And that's the thing that maybe we need to think about. Before we just mention a few closing points, I just want to mention again our sponsors of this show, which is John Catt Books, all right, which is our sponsor on this program today and on Teachers Talk Radio generally, publishers of professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning. If you want to benefit from that deal, is 20% off if you use the code JCTTR2425. So get over to John Catt at the John Catt website. Right. So obviously we're coming. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes. We don't have to end perfectly on the bell, so to speak. But so it's like I said, I do think I do think things have changed quite a lot. What, in terms of like the future, then how do you see the profession going, Scott, in terms of the problems that we've got? Do you think that there are any solutions? Obviously, there's no easy solutions to the problem that we've got of these more serious behaviour incidents, but what do you see as the future, and where do you think we go from here?
Yeah, this was discussed with a lot of us at a conference, the NU conference just recently. AI is going to have a massive impact. Whether we like it or not. My son's doing A levels at the moment, and they all just use AI. Everyone just uses AI. It's so embedded now. And how do we change the examinations? Do we go to oral examinations? Talk about your subject for 2 hours. To build up skills and critical skills and opinions. There's lots of opportunities. But I think you touched on a key point. What's teaching going to look like? In a behaviour school, could you have teachers on 5-year contracts that don't join unions, that don't pay into pensions, that are on £60,000 a year? Perhaps that would kind of inspire them. But you might need some people with more therapeutic informed education if they're going to work with those kind of children in those hospital therapeutic recovery schools, whatever you want to call it. Will they need a knowledge-rich education in AI? I don't know. Are we going to have educators or more therapists working in schools? We're practically there in some schools already. So there's a lot of questions going to come around. I do think AI is going to, center some of that. But teachers will always probably be in the middle somewhere, as we kind of started off the conversation, and then the conversations. The teachers we carry the weight from above and from below, and that's what makes us strong, but also exposes weaknesses throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, do you think maybe that there's always been students that start maybe cut out for school, for the classroom? Do you think maybe that's becoming an increasing thing, that using AI, maybe there is a way that we can change how schools operate? Maybe we can be more, have some kind of mixture between a school-based and a home sort of based education. Do you think maybe that's the way that we might start to go? Do you think maybe there's students who just will never cope in a classroom environment?
Yeah, I think that could happen. Imagine if schools were just about people's embodied experience, where you did art, music, sports for all those hours with no screens whatsoever, and it was kind of like more like Steiner schools, kind of self-led, and it's that kind of socializing experience where AI and robots and everything going to be do the kind of the drudgery in the future. So I do revising the social contract might be an opportunity to revise what schools provide and offer at the same time.
Okay, fab. Yeah, thank you for that. Is there anything that you've sort of been working with recently that you think, anything that I haven't asked you that you think might be interesting to share?
I think the big thing on the horizon, I think, is going to be the huge drop in pupil numbers. There's a huge demographic drop. My wife's a midwife, and she'll say, you think it's bad now, you should look at the birth rate. There's a lot of things we're going to have to really think about, whether that's 4-day weeks, 3-day weeks, schools being kept open, for kind of hybrid home and school learning, schools being shut, whether we turn, in Norfolk, I think we've got to really have a conversation about some villages will turn, and towns might even turn into kind of Southwold retirement kind of villages once you take the children and the school and the parents out of there and turn it into a kind of pseudo retirement village, Airbnb tourist occasion, because the number of, look at the number of schools shutting in London. We're not going to need the same numbers of schools. So what do we do? Where we've got less children in our society in the country.
Yeah, it's certainly concerning. We could all be, with the rise of AI and less students, we could all be out of a job sooner.
Yeah. There's lots of
Let's not
Let's
end on
hope
that, Scott. Let's not end
No,
on
no, but there is opportunities. Perhaps a 4-day week. That community schooling, hybrid, everything we just kind of mentioned. Kind of embodied learning, embodied education. Getting children's heads out of social media and out of kind of technology might be something that could be a kind of unifying, coherent message given to parents.
And that's something we maybe haven't touched on, isn't it? The fact that students are immersed in this video world, aren't they? And the impact that has on sort of well-being and mood and everything else. I know if I stick a game of FIFA on and I start to lose, I get the rage, and it's like I just feel, I don't know. It's a very, very powerful thing, and I don't know to what extent, we haven't touched on it here, but to what extent that's also a factor in terms of behaviour. Students, children just immersed in that world, and us trying to drag them out of this virtual world all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So that might be a discussion for another day. I just want to say, is there anything else you wanted to add, Scott, before we...
No, thank you. Just to say thank you. I think these are really important conversations. This is what teachers, I think, want to hear. And they I think part of the surveys that you mentioned, I mentioned, is sometimes people's voices aren't heard, and especially when it's female voices not being heard in schools, it adds extra injury. And I think it's really important that we do talk about this openly, honestly.
Yeah, and it certainly seems a bit hypocritical to talk about it with the students, but then not enact that in our professional lives for the teachers as well. So we need to protect the teachers in order to protect the staff. So, the message is always join a union, guys. If you're not in a union,
absolutely,
what are you doing? You must be in a union. I just want to say thanks ever so much to Scott. I really appreciate your time. It's been hopefully a useful conversation for people, but it's been really interesting to get your insights from your end, Scott. So thank you ever so much.
No, thank you.
Hopefully, maybe we'll catch up again in the future, and maybe it'll be nice if we can have a bit more of a sort of a positive conversation, and things are maybe starting to go a better way with these statistics.
Would love that.
Okay. All right. Thanks everyone who's joined us. It's always nice to see people keeping up to date with what's topical in education. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you very much, and I will see you all again in 2 weeks' time on the Twilight Show. Good night, everybody.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.